welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the program Natalia Schwien Scott. Natalia, thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm so excited and humbled and honored to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, really a pleasure to talk with you. You do a lot of cool stuff, so it's really happy to invite you on here. And you're an herbalist, wildlife rescue and rehabilitation apprentice, PhD student in the study of religion at Harvard University, a university some people might have heard of before, a little known university. And you research relational ontologies, post-human ethics. You also have a secondary degree in Celtic languages and literatures, which we definitely have to talk about. Very interested in trans-species soul migration. And so you're also a musician. And so so many things. And
Many things.
so many things. You wear a lot of hats. And also, you co-founded with Rachel Peterson, who we're also going to talk with on this program, the Thinking with Plants and Fungi initiative, which just had a conference in May. So many things to talk about. But what I'm always interested in hearing is kind of the person behind all of this stuff. How did you get interested in these kind of things? Especially to me, I mean, it's a forum on religion and ecology. A
Mm.
lot of people study religion, don't touch the natural world. It's all about transcendence, otherworldly things. And vice versa. People get into environmental stuff. It's all about activism or policy or
Mhm.
science. So how did you, where's the, and that could be, you're like, well, it started when I was 5 years old. And, it could be a very long story. But I'm curious, how did you come to this kind of work?
Yeah, that's it. It started when I was 5 years old is kind of my trajectory, so I'll try to keep it brief and not give you a play-by-play of 35 years of life. My mom, I think I think a good way of putting it is like a small neurodivergent person running around the world with military parents. My mom was really quite, I think, desperate to find ways to keep me engaged and to allow me to explore my imagination. And the main aspects of the world and of my very small existence at that around under the age of 10, the main thing that I was excited about was always the natural world. And my mom very thoughtfully put me in an herbalism apprenticeship when I was 10,
Mm.
and had me in classes on recognizing birdsong. We listened to a lot of recordings in the car of different ways to like mimic or make music around the sounds of birds or the sounds of animals. We did a lot of reading aloud about the natural world, and she gave me the Redwall books. We read a lot of like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien as well, but the Redwall
Oh,
books by
nice.
Ron Jacks, and those really threw me into this space where like I can't say that I have ever had a period in my life where I remember a distinct moment of being like, oh, wow, consciousness or sentience or engagement is everywhere. That just was always the case. And
Mm.
I have to credit my mom for that, that she was very careful about placing me into educational spaces where imagination was always central, and relationship was always central. So that's really where this started. And then from the age of 10 up through today, I've just continued to take classes where I can, to apprentice where I can, to try to learn new skills so that I can better engage. And a lot of the work that I've done, I see myself as, um, and not just myself, there's a lot of colleagues and friends who are in a similar space as sort of a bridge between worlds where I feel very at home and more comfortable, perhaps, in wilder spaces, or with non-humans than I do in more human spaces. But I've learned to navigate human spaces in ways in which I feel like I can help to uh, teach and relate and hold space for those who want to be in relationship but don't necessarily know how to step in.
Mm.
So I've had the opportunity to work with people like Vanessa Shakur. She's an herbalist and an author. She had an organization called Sacred Warrior that I was involved in for many years that led plant walks and camping retreats. And did We were based out of Brooklyn, but
Hmm.
we did work in Costa Rica and in Scotland,
Oh,
where she builds relationships between wildlife organizations, rewilding organizations, and like the Wolf Conservation Center in South Salem, New York, is an example. We led numerous camping trips there where we would bring campers out into the woods and talk about what plants were growing, who was growing, why they were growing there, and at the same time be in this space where they had, at the time, I'm not sure what the numbers are now, 34, they had about 34 wolves that were candidates for re-release into the wild,
wow.
for release into the wild. And so I wasn't, part of the Wolf Conservation Center's team. I was part of Vanessa's team, but this relationship between thinking about how a different species, whether that's a plant or an animal or a human, how we're interacting with each other and what interconnectedness looks like, was really central to not just the like classes and experiences that my mom put me in when I was a kid, but really continued in different pedagogical experiences or different, choices that I made as I got older of where I wanted to learn and how I wanted to learn. Um,
Nice. But here's one of the things you mentioned that your mom got you into an herbalist apprenticeship.
yeah.
I know people who have a strong desire to get into herbalism, and they're like, where do you learn this stuff? Because
Mm,
obviously, like traditional schools and things like that, you're not getting that from a mainstream education.
yeah.
So,
Unfortunately.
yeah, unfortunately, yeah, it should be like essential. And
Yeah.
instead, it's like, ah, that's not important and it's outdated and folk superstitious,
Mm,
whatever. And increasingly, I feel like more and more people are like, oh, no, there's a lot of wisdom there. But then they're looking for people around. They're like, where do I learn this?
mhm.
So, who are these people who are doing apprenticeships?
A great question. And when I get asked a lot, I also get asked, what books should I buy?
Right.
And my response
That's
of,
where I
yeah,
go is that, well, there's got to be books. And people are like, it's not
yeah.
just books, Sam. There's real world knowledge. It's about interacting with actual plants. I'm like, there's books about plants.
There's so many books about plants. You could have an entire library of just books about plants, and it wouldn't even, scratch the surface of how to be in relationship with plants.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard. Yeah, I think the best way that I can or the best advice I can give is to look at who's in your immediate region, because obviously when you're dealing with plants, you're dealing with regions.
Right.
And to better understand what kind of a herbalism lineage you're interested in,
Mm,
because again, it's land-based, so understanding what kind of uh, history you want to engage with, and um, like for example, like the herbalism that I've mostly looked at coming out of Scottish and Irish and British traditions is very different than say Chinese herbalism.
right.
And so being able to understand what kind of relationships you're interested in building is really central, I think, to understanding who you want to work with,
Hmm.
whether that's plants or people, and in herbalism both. So look at your immediate region. Who is an herbalist or a naturalist, botanist? Who are the people that are already working with plants in your immediate spaces? Including what are some, like I took courses at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, for
Hmm.
example, or the New Canaan Nature Center, or um, spaces up here in Vermont. I've taken a couple classes. There's Sage Mountain with Rosemary Gladstar up here in Vermont. So there's different options for looking at institutions as well as people that are in the area. See if they're offering classes. Going on plant walks is a great first start,
Hmm.
or a great first step, rather. And um, I mean, I think that will probably be a more helpful beginning or introduction rather than to first turn to books, because it's a lot of information. And the most important thing is to learn how to identify.
Right.
And photos of plants are always going to be a little different than what the plant themselves look like and who they're in relationship with in their environment. And so, working with someone who really has a lot of um, a lot of experience, I think is the best first step. When it came to my first apprenticeship when I was 10, this was a woman at my parents' church
Hmm.
who just made salves and oils
Hmm.
and vinegars and lotions and all sorts of different things in her kitchen. And she mostly worked out of a garden, but she also sometimes foraged. And so I mostly worked in the garden with her, and that was the initial experience of learning how to, how to make like a foot bath,
Hmm.
or how to like make a lotion, or how to make a poultice. And learning how to identify, but also learning what, like, I mean, she wasn't so technical for a 10-year-old on like, here are the chemical compounds in time that may
Right.
affect, so it wasn't so much like the sort of technical side of herbalism that I've gotten more training in as the years have gone by. But I think just that initial relationship building of learning to identify, learning to also to have to approach with a sense of imagination.
Hmm.
And granted, if you're starting that as an adult, that might be a little daunting to
Right.
um, open that space up. But I think at least my experience of watching adults in spaces learn about this, whether that's been when I've been working with Vanessa Shakur or when it's been that I'm leading a plant walk in for at Harvard Divinity School, or leading a one of our Thinking with Plants and Fungi reading groups where we're combining whatever we're reading with going outside and talking about who's growing in the immediate Harvard environment at the Divinity School. That Yeah, that just like that sense of wonder, bringing that sense of wonder into the relationship is really central. I hope that's helpful. I don't know if that's that helpful, but I hope it is.
I think that's pretty helpful. It's tough because there isn't a one size fits all answer to that question.
No.
And so exactly you're like, well, you're gonna have to look in your region and see who's around.
Yeah.
And but I do
And who's
appreciate that.
willing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point. People are like, look, I'm around, but I'm not willing to do
Yeah.
this. I got enough stuff going on
Right.
that trying to help you. And plant walks. And that's one of those things, like, because I'm too bookish as a person. So I'll be hanging out with somebody walking around and they're like, oh, there's mugwort over there. I'm like, really? How did you see that? It doesn't look like it looked in the book. And so
Yeah.
it's a different kind of perception that comes from that engagement and that relationship. And
And
then,
just experience.
yeah, I'm like, really, books don't count as experience? So I look up to folks with that kind of knowledge so much. So in the meantime, you have learned the chemical compounds in time.
Yeah, I mean, working with thymals and a couple different plants, but I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is when we look at um modern synthesized medication that's coming out of lab spaces,
Hmm.
trying to identify what the chemical compounds that are the active compounds in those medications are.
Right.
And then I like to try to trace them back to see where
Mm.
they were derived from, or what plants or animals they are occurring naturally in,
Hmm.
as a means of thinking about how, well, nothing comes out of nothing, right? And
Right.
so anything that's synthesized has an origin in and so where is that origin coming from, and how does that then make us think about relationships? Something that has
Right.
come up for me in this space has been another teacher and friend of mine. Her name is Sarah Carrico. She's at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. She's an arachnologist. And she was working when she was doing field research in Madagascar. She was working with the community there, as well as the project was funded by a pharmaceutical company to extract venom from certain spiders that
Hmm.
are endemic to that area. And she developed what was called the spider accords, which was to think about how the extraction of these spiders, and specifically for their venom for pharmaceutical purposes, again, to make the connection of like, no, our drugs come from somewhere, like
Right.
our medications come from somewhere. Where do they come from? They might be synthesized now, but where were they coming from originally? So she developed this something called the spider accords, which
Hmm.
was to find ways in which that extractive uh, tendency that we see so often in coming out of certain paradigms and approaches to land, how could that give back in more literal ways
Hmm.
to the community, but also to the spiders themselves?
Hmm.
And yeah, she did some really, really cool work about thinking about how if we're pulling from an animal, how does what does giving back look like
Hmm.
in that kind of space? And so that's something that I'm really interested in is like if we trace back the compounds, how does that then create a bond of accountability with whatever species we pulled that medication from,
Right.
originally, or the chemical compound from? And so one example is that I was looking at Mucinex,
Hmm.
and trying to trace back where Mucinex came from. And I would need to verify this again, but I kept coming back to tobacco has the same chemical
Oh, really?
compound as
Oh.
Mucinex, which in some ways makes sense. Something that, like a mullein plant, for example, smoking mullein, the original asthma inhalers, as some herbalists like to say, because it can soothe, but also that we don't think of smoke as the
Right.
thing that can smooth lungs or smooth
Yeah.
the throat, soothe rather, or like lobelia plants for helping to smoking it in order to help cut out nicotine. And so thinking about how it's sort of gonna try to how can I say this? The practice of perhaps smoking or the way in which the tobacco plant has been bastardized.
Hmm.
How can then we, by tracing those chemical relationships that happen in labs, how can we then go back to the plants and rebuilds relationship as well as
Right.
relationship with the communities, like what Sarah did with this community in Madagascar, rebuilds and support the relationships that pre-existed the extraction that came from
Right.
a, you know, uh, so-called Western methodology or industrialized methodology
Right.
of pulling the compound from the relationship. Is that am I articulating that in a way that made any sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I really appreciate that because I feel like there's a thing. I mean, I'm in California, in the Bay Area. A lot of people into herbalism hate studying chemicals. And and I'm like, no, we have to build that bridge.
Yeah.
And otherwise, there's this terrible bifurcation where the people who are into plants don't study the chemicals, people who are into chemicals aren't studying the plants. I'm
Yeah.
like, no, we can have both.
Hmm.
And modern chemistry and pharmacology is fantastic, but it's also built on an extractive paradigm and things like that.
Right.
So it's like building that bridge, I think, is really important. So no, I really appreciate that.
I
And
think one way to, can I add to that really quick, Sam?
yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to jump in.
Oh no, not at all. Jeez.
I guess I've been thinking about how to characterize my work because especially for like my parents, how do I,
Right,
what do I do,
right,
And also, there's so many hats. How do I describe what it is I do? So I think I sit at this intersection of like mythology slash folklore, folk and myth, as they put in departments, folk and myth
right,
and science. And science, what I when I'm using that term, I mean it as both an ideology but also a process and methodology.
mm,
And identifying how the ideologies that are within what we categorize as science now are not necessarily like they are interpretive lenses. They are not data itself. It's a way of looking at data. Similar to folk and myth is a way of looking at data. I'm
right.
deeply reducing these things by saying that, but I'm trying to point to, I think when we look at folklore and mythology, and again, that's where I came in with the Celtic languages and literatures research, was to look at how non-humans, whether that was plants or animals or bugs or spirits, how they were being, what the sort of ethical framework was, or the relational framework was in the folklore and mythology. So if stories are an opportunity, one opportunity to explain or to express or to engage in what ethical relationships look like that are culturally specific, then that provides a paradigm through which to think about the data itself
Right.
in some ways. So, like an example could be I was doing coursework in a course called Experimental Research Methodologies in Neuroscience, I think was the name of the
Hmm.
class. And I was working in a lab, and I was part of a project that was looking at the breakdown of adipose tissue in fruit flies as a means of synthesizing a medication that would, like, or eventually trying to figure out a medication that would help with the breakdown of adipose tissue in humans.
Hmm.
Uh, and I was really interested in this, or I am very interested in these model species and how we think about model species. And so if a fruit fly's breakdown of adipose tissue is in some way close enough as a building block to a human's breakdown of adipose tissue, then I think that means that we need to take the fruit fly in some way seriously.
Right.
Um, and so I was interested in that. One of the oldest texts that we have in uh, Irish material is the wooing of Eetoin. And in this tale, and I'll try to just briefly tell it, Eetoin is beloved of an Irish king named Mither, and he's already married. And in Brehon law, you can marry again. You just have to get permission from your first wife.
Hmm.
And his first wife did not give him permission, but he
Hmm.
marries his love anyways, Eetoin. And his first wife is like, you've broken the law, and this is absolutely not with my consent. And so she has the right to retaliate, but she retaliates far too strongly. And she turns Etoine into a series of different, at one point, Etoine's a puddle, but Etoine eventually emerges as a fly. And she's the most beautiful fly that ever there was. And she sings this beautiful song. And when she sings, she's able to quiet the minds of tortured warriors. So basically, her voice is like a PTSD cure. Um, and she sings on the pillow of Mither the king, and she's just this beloved, beautiful fly. And so I was thinking about this, about like here I am reading and translating a text about this beautiful fly, and then I go into a lab space where I'm dissecting using neuroscience tools, fly larvae, and like measuring their adipose tissue and looking at their little brains. And so how do I make sense of these two spaces together? And I think that that is a lot of the work of um, religious studies scholars in these spaces, I guess, is to point out that these are that there are ideologies that are framing methodologies, and that nothing is value free. It always comes with some sort of philosophical backdrop or philosophical commitments, rather,
Hmm.
religious commitments, theological commitments. And so to move between those spaces and to say, well, there's actually texts that talk about how to be in relationship with flies. There's lots of material also of Irish rural communities being really proud of their compost piles.
Hmm.
That's, I mean, if we're taking cultural specificity seriously, that kind of a relationship that we see in the material is indicative of a kind of way in which to be in relationship with the actual fly or the
Right.
actual compost pile. And so, yeah, that kind of that's how I'm situating myself and my work, is at this like intersection of myth and science.
Yeah, that's such cool work. And I really appreciate the point of what do I tell my parents that I do? That's very difficult, even for just somebody who's
Oh,
squarely in one discipline. But when you're crossing these different disciplines, it becomes even more difficult. Like,
yeah.
what are you doing with your life? You're like, well, there's
Like,
a
you're
handful of
dissecting a
threads.
fly today? Why are you doing
Yeah.
that? Like, I thought you were like reading about ritual. I'm like, I am. I'm now practicing ritual in a lab. I'm doing
Yeah.
both.
Yeah. I think that's so important. Well, and along the way, you mentioned your work in Celtic languages and literatures, which my like ethnicity is largely Irish and Scottish, and so always been interested in Celtic perspectives. Haven't done a lot of research in it, but I'm always enamored with it. So I appreciate that you have studied that, but
Likewise
especially
enamored with it.
hard not to be.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And but of all things, trans-species soul migration.
Mm.
Uh, that couldn't be more interesting to me. What did you find? Again, like if you were telling your parents, they're like, you're just studying trans-species soul migration in Celtic language and literature. What are
What
you
does that mean? What are you talking
Yeah,
about?
what are you doing?
Oh,
So yeah, I have to hear about that.
yeah, happy to talk about it. Oh my God, it's so exciting when people let you talk about your hyper focuses. So yeah, it came from the original interest, I would say. I was lucky enough to grow up with a close relationship with my grandfather. I still have a close relationship with him, who is very proud of his Irish heritage and was very involved in Irish theater in New York City and in supporting the Abbey Theater in Dublin
Mm,
and in building these bridges between different businesses and organizations, mostly in New York, some in Chicago, but also then with communities and businesses in Ireland. And he traced his family tree, and I just attended so many events,
mm,
whether that was like a dinner with his Irish associates or a lot of theater. I went to a ton of Irish theater, and then I ended up interning at the Abbey Theater in Dublin when I was in my early 20s.
cool.
And this just this like love of the literature came out, and
Mm,
in the literature there is such a deep love of land. You cannot escape this deep love of land that's central to literature in Ireland, especially the medieval literature.
mm,
And so when I started my master's at Harvard 6 years ago, I started taking classes on Irish mythology, and I had read material on my own and been, I had a sort of basic understanding of what I was getting myself into, but not a real understanding of what I was getting myself into,
right.
especially not when it comes to the languages, because Old Irish is extremely complicated and difficult. It is such a beautiful language, the ways in which it engages with land, especially in my perspective. It's stunning, but it's also really, really hard. And I am a very slow translator. So I started taking these classes, and what I noticed in what's trans-species soul migration is that in all of these um, medieval tales, a person was being and a person by person I mean um usually beginning as a human, but not always, was being transformed into different animals. And it also then happened in some of the Welsh material as well, like in the Mabinogion or the Mabinogi, there's a similar migration occurring, but some essence of the person was continuing in these different iterations. You also find it in the poetry as well. Taliesin, the great Welsh bard, speaks about his different lives, where he's a salmon, he's a variety of things. And one of the things that I found really interesting is that this was continuing to occur in the medieval Christianized spaces, obviously. So all of the material that we have from Ireland, transcribed in the medieval period that would have been oral material previously, was transcribed by monks. And so there's always questions about, how much of this has been redacted or is biased or whatever else. But I'm less concerned with pulling apart uh, the material than I am of like what's pre-Christian, what's Christian. With let's just look at the material itself. That's what's I think to me much more interesting. And in spaces like or in stories like the Children of Lear, for example, which is again a very old text, well, texts, collated text. Um, the the children of Lear who are part of the Tuatha De Danann, which are the sort of the fairy race that exists on in Ireland before the Celts arrived. They're the children of this prominent Tuatha, a member of the Tuatha, this prominent um, man named Lear. And the children are transformed into swans by their sort of wicked stepmother character. But she's very complicated as well because she also is dealing with to reduce her into a wicked stepmother is unfair of me. That's not a good way of putting it. So she who is as punishment turned into the wind. So these children are turned into these four swans, and while they're still living with the Tuatha De Danann, they are the Dinashi, they are sort of like a twin. They sing this beautiful song. They're so beloved of their community. They're different members of their community go to them for their wisdom as these sort of human in the bodies of swans. And this actually happens. There's all these turning into swans that occur in different stories. The Dream of Angus is another one where he's
Hmm.
transformed into a swan and he marries a swan woman.
Hmm.
She's already a swan, so she moves between bodies. You can see this in the later folklore as well. Some, characters like the Selkie is another, I think, maybe not trans-species soul migration, but another example of this transformative characteristic of a single understanding of a self, which we might call a soul in a contemporary understanding of what that might look like, moving between different bodies. And so in the Children of Lear, they do eventually get turned back into humans and then pretty much die immediately once they're back into the human form. And in the wooing of a twain, she eventually gets swallowed. And when she is swallowed by this woman, she impregnates the woman and then is born as a human child and recognized as who she is. So there's this aspect of self that's continued through these different lives, essentially, whether they are in human form or not in human form. Sometimes they're in deer form or swan form or a puddle or the wind or a bird, but still there's this like maintenance that's occurring. Some sort of self is maintained, and they can remember themselves in these different iterations, and sometimes they forget themselves and sometimes they remember themselves again. So this it had, scholars like Philip Freeman have called this like a system of reincarnation. It could be that we could argue it that way. But I like this idea of this like trans-species soul migration, that you can have this sense of soul that moves between different bodies, different kinds of bodies, and both forgets and remembers itself at the same time.
Yeah.
And so is that helpful? Did I explain that in a way that I kind of went on a rant, but
No, that's very helpful and fascinating. And I have you published on this? Is there a book I can read?
oh, there's lots of books I could point to that talk about this, but no, I haven't published on this yet. I'm speaking this fall at the
Hmm.
Harvard Celtic Colloquium, um, Celtic Studies Colloquium on some of this. I'm looking specifically at the Bulia Swivna material, which is another medieval collation of texts, or collation of texts written in the medieval period about a wild man. He's like
Hmm.
a king, warrior king, turned poet prophet who
Hmm.
in the piece that I'm analyzing, I'm looking at he addresses plants in the vocative.
Hmm.
It's in the grammar of the Old Irish, both the vocative and the diminutive is written into the grammar.
Oh, interesting.
So my question is, if it exists in the grammar and we take that seriously in other spaces where we're talking about the importance of language, especially in decolonial contexts or contexts of kinship theory,
Hmm.
then we should take this seriously in this space. And to
Right.
not take that seriously is, I think, to further projects of epistemological white supremacy. To
Hmm.
not say like, wait, this exists here too. This is a bridge of comparative, comparative work that can be done. So yeah, which isn't exactly trans-species soul migration, but it sort of touches on this like relationship with the more than human that exists in the material. And
Right.
then the other thing that I'm working on, two articles that are in the works. So we'll see if they how they go with reviewers. One is looking at these different bird forms of
Hmm.
transitions between human and bird uh, in um, in Irish, but also in some of the Norse material as well,
Hmm.
which is not my area of focus, but it's part of this identity question that even Yeats touched on like what's on identity in Ireland is complicated because of
Right.
invasions.
Yeah.
And so,
To put it
uh,
mildly.
yeah, casual. And even Yeats was of mixed descents, of Norse and Irish descents, and he
Oh.
was criticized for this by his contemporaries as not being Irish enough.
Hmm.
And as were many other, or have been many other people who are in, this is, always this question of belonging. And
Hmm.
he uses geese as a way of thinking through identity and belonging specifically because of their migration patterns. And so I had sort of latched onto
Hmm.
that as like, let's look at what the medieval material says about this.
Right.
And part of that is that there is this capacity to transition literally between bird and human body and have this very complex identity that exists in the material and how that interacts with his questions on belonging and identity. And then on the other side, which is more modern, is looking at Robert Kirk, who's a 17th century
Hmm.
Episcopalian minister in
Hmm.
Scotland who did a very, what we would call an early ethnography, I suppose. Um, and you might recognize the title because Philip Pullman stole it for one of his recent books. Well, he credits, he doesn't just steal, he credits. It's called The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies.
Oh.
And it is just one of the most beautiful and brilliant little treaties. I highly suggest anyone who's interested in this stuff reads
Hmm.
it. But there's this similar thing that occurs there where he talks about sort of in like an Origenian way, like Origin of Alexandria, because he's talking about Neoplatonism and applying Neoplatonism to this Scottish Highlander
Hmm.
cosmology.
Hmm.
This movement of souls and these like placements of souls, including fairies, as part of this world.
Hmm.
And so I've been working on these two pieces, these arguments. I've lectured on that previously at the Celtic Colloquium, but yeah. So is there a specific book I can point you to? No, but there are references I'd be happy to share, and also there's previous talks and hopefully some articles, upcoming articles.
That's fascinating. And yeah, that's one of those things where I hate to give people homework. I'm like, could you just write a book, please? Because that would help me out a lot.
I need to
Uh,
take off some hats so I can just
I know,
focus on
right? Yeah.
writing a
Yeah.
while.
You have a lot going on.
Too
You know,
much.
and speaking of which, I know that you led the conversation group exploring animism, posthumanism, and entangled roots of interrelation.
Yes.
And so much of what you're saying is like the word animism keeps popping into my head. Another word, I'm curious because you would know better than I. Sometimes I use this word and people get mad. Sometimes they go, okay, paganism.
Oh yeah.
Right? It's complicated. It's a fraught term.
Yeah.
But would like if I was like, well, Nordic, Germanic, Celtic, these are different forms of paganism. And is it
Well,
okay to say that? What's wrong with that? Mm.
Oh, Sam, great question. A funny side story. So I just published an article with Pomegranate, the International Journal for Pagan Studies, specifically on plant personhood in the
Hmm.
study of Western esotericism. And I talk a little bit about paganism, but I also talk about like why isn't the word animism being used in so much of the foundational material on Western esotericism, and why isn't the agency that's so obviously present in the material that these different contemporary scholars are referencing? Why aren't we talking about that? There is an acknowledgement of agency in the non-human actors in these
Hmm.
ritual spaces, and is that not animism? And so that paper is called "The Plant Delighteth," which
Hmm.
comes from another text. I also look at gardening literature
Hmm.
and the history of gardening literature. I did way too much in one article, but I had to get it all out. But yeah, the term paganism is well, one, I would differentiate between contemporary neo-paganism and a historical understanding, or a paganism and a historical understanding. But I think the really fraught area, which is, I am not the first to say this by any means, is this period of the medieval period, which is how we so often see, or we have seen, I think it's less so now, scholars saying, well, this is Christian, that's pagan, that's this. That's very, I think it's almost again, I think it's less interesting than just looking at the material itself and saying, no, these are existing in
Hmm.
the same space, because lived religion is so rarely
Right.
clearly one thing, you
Right.
know? And lived religion so rarely follows the rules.
Yeah.
I think one scholar that I point to all the time about this is Sabina Maioko's work on contemporary. She was looking at contemporary pagans or neo-paganism, but she ended up looking a lot at Catholics, and she
Hmm.
looked at the Rainbow Bridge. And she wrote this
Oh.
really interesting article on vernacular animisms.
Hmm.
Vernacular ontologies, and saying like, well, these are practicing Catholics, but they believe in the Rainbow Bridge, which we might describe within the realm or the umbrella of animism. So
Hmm.
she's so, but that doesn't fit within traditional Catholic practice or traditional Catholic like hegemonic paradigm. However, that being said, there's actually a ton of material from the medieval period and post that. Another really great scholar who talks about this is Carl Steele. How he has a great book called How to Not Make a Human:
Hmm.
Pets, Feral Children, Worms, Sky Burials, and Oysters. I'm looking at it right now.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
but looking at, there's so much material in the medieval period where animals and plants are completely agents, whether that's in these ritual settings or in the mythology that we have transcribed during that period, or in the theological work. I mean, you could look at Hildegard von Bingen's writing
Hmm.
and say, is that not animism in some
Right.
way? I mean, it's functioning within a specific ontology, but Mark Wallace, for example, whose book When God Was a Bird, that looks at animism and
Right.
Christianity, he's arguing this, that these exist in the same space. Why are we trying to pull them apart? And is it not more interesting to identify the places in which, like, no, this is animist practice happening in Christianity? So
Hmm.
I think, we have this anxiety that occurs in contemporary pagan studies, which is this like, what can we call this form of belief, paganism or Christianity? It's both.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's both. And paganism in a more his I really like to reference just the Latin use of the word, which is to say that it just means of the land.
Right.
And that a lot of what we call paganism historically are land-based practices that may or may not continue within a Catholic paradigm, which, we see a lot in arguments around like feast days. All
Right.
Hallows Eve is
Right.
actually Samhain, looking at Candlemas is actually, all these
Yeah.
this is actually the solstice. Yes,
Right.
it is. Yeah, and I don't think that the lived religion of those times would have differentiated so clearly as we are differentiating, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. At least that's not
Hmm.
what the material seems to do. Another example is that when we look at like the witch burnings in Scotland, for example,
Hmm.
Ireland didn't have witch burnings. Scotland did. A lot of the the material collected of confessions or of accusations are people uttering these. I'm going to use the word syncretic. I know that that's a complicated word, but
Right.
they're saying things that are both Catholic and what we might label as pagan in the same prayers. So they're
Hmm.
saying words over things. They're performing ritual over
Right.
things. And then they're being punished for it. But they understood themselves, as far as we can tell from the material, as practicing like Catholic practices. They didn't see themselves as doing something outside of that.
Right.
And so that kind of goes into sort of the, Walter Hanegraaff argument or Christopher Partridge argument or many other people's arguments of like a culture is ordinary. That a lot of what we are labeling as pagan historically are things that were happening in these complex syncretic spaces, and we're entangled with each other. And that that doesn't necessarily make it more or less valid as a epistemological or even like lineage, I think, or as like a for a contemporary pagan. Um, that's kind of where I think about paganism is that I'm more interested in the what does the material itself say than to identify to pull it apart and say this is this and that is that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, that's a really great answer, and I like that. Like, as if paganism and animism aren't contested enough terms, you throw syncretism in there as well,
Hmm.
and so yeah,
I
they're all
know. I
such
don't use it in publications, but
right.
yeah,
Uh,
not a good one.
yeah, it's so complicated, and I think the appeal to lived religion is a great way to solve that. You're like, let's look at what people were actually doing, and let's worry a little less about the academic categories we're using. Because then it's like, well, okay, I'm writing some encyclopedia. So is it going to go under paganism or is it going to go under
Right.
animism and things like that? It's like, that's maybe the wrong way to think, or not wrong, but there's so much more to learn when you look at lived religion.
Yeah, I
So
think
yeah, I appreciate that. And that, especially that you're like, it doesn't make it like a less valid approach if you're mixing Catholicism with paganism. I would say maybe conversely, it makes it maybe more valid. And that
mm,
if somehow you have some kind of Christianity that is completely abstracted from your relationship to land,
mm,
that might not be the most robust epistemology. So,
yeah.
uh, so, but yeah, no,
Yeah.
I like that a lot, and appreciate the Mark Wallace reference too, because the Christian animism. Because I was raised Catholic, I was raised Catholic. It's like, well, what's your relationship to that faith now? It's complicated.
Yeah, very
But
complicated.
at a certain point, I really fell in love with indigenous traditions, paganism, whatever that might mean, animism. And so to see people who are like, no, those aren't incompatible. In fact,
Mm,
historically, largely compatible.
yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate that a lot.
I think
And
also on that
yes.
note, Sam, I think one thing that I try to articulate or differentiate, especially when I'm talking about Catholicism, is that I'm a Celtic languages and literatures. That's where my secondary work is. Catholicism functions really differently in Ireland than, say, it does in Spain.
Right.
And so when I'm talking about Catholicism, I'm speaking about a specific region.
Right.
And that is really so, for example, I am one of my best friends who we do a lot of sharing work with one another and thinking through things together, studies Mesoamerican metaphysics. In her name's Rebecca Mendoza. And so when she's looking at the way in which Mesoamerican cultures are engaging or are being forced conversions and the violence that's occurring under Catholicism and that in those spaces, and at the same time, you also see these practices that are complicated combinations of different of the pre-existing indigenous belief systems as well as the Catholic practices. We can see that with Dia de los Muertos or um, I mean, a variety of things. She writes specifically on Copal as this sort of entry point into
Mm,
thinking about those very complex relationships.
mm.
That iteration of Catholicism is very different than the iteration of Catholicism that I'm looking at in medieval Ireland.
Right.
Even if there are, in, you know, uh, comparable relationships to colonialism that occur
Right.
with Ireland and the British Empire. And certainly, the violence that I think St. Patrick specifically enacted on some communities is very different than, say, St. Bridget's approach to
Right.
Catholicism. So
Right.
there's this specificity that I think gets lost when we have these sort of umbrella categories of like, this is what that is, and it can't be anything else. And you're like,
Hmm.
well, it's really different in really different spaces. And that specificity, I think, again, allows us to have more interesting conversations, but also to more carefully advocate for cultural specificity and
Hmm.
for you know, decolonial approaches to be able to say, no, this is like how it's done here, this is how it's done here, and how beautiful that it's done in different ways in different places, or how horrible it's done in different ways, like how awful that this same worldview perpetuated so much violence in this space and this space.
Right.
And then you can then again say, like, well, the Irish as a culture have, especially recently, been really mindful about remembering their colonial history and
Hmm.
remembering the violence that they've experienced,
Yeah.
and being able to say, like, we won't tolerate that continuing. We know what it's like to lose 1 million people to famine that
Yeah.
didn't really exist. I mean, it obviously existed, but that was a fabricated
Right.
famine. And
Yeah.
so, and some of my interest in the Scottish side as well as like the Highland clearances around, we don't know exactly how many, but around 100,000 people forcefully removed from their homelands, the complete destruction of the temperate rainforests of Ireland and Scotland. The Highlands shouldn't be treeless.
Yeah.
They look empty. They're
Yeah.
empty of people and empty of trees. That's not what they looked like before the British cut down all the trees to build the British Navy. And so, you get these obviously these this Jane Olemeyer writes about this in her book Making Empire, about
Hmm.
Ireland, that Ireland was the laboratory for British
Right.
imperialism, that you see it that enacted everywhere else the same methods that they used on Ireland, but they used on Scotland in many ways too. It's just
Right.
more complicated space since they're more regionally entangled. So yeah, I think that specificity, especially also then in the Scottish side of like Catholicism and Protestantism function totally differently in Scotland than they do in Ireland.
Right.
So just this like, okay, what are the entanglements that are regional?
Yeah.
And then how does that then help us to look at what these like larger commitments might be?
Well, thanks. You're really kind of pushing my buttons in terms like, okay, I want to go study so much of all the things you're talking about because I feel like I'm on the verge of some of these things, especially the way that Ireland was kind of the laboratory for British imperialism and colonialism, and then dot 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 native genocide in the United States.
Yeah.
And obviously, the Irish currently were some of the first people to call out the genocide in Gaza. And they're
Mhm.
like, yeah, we know it when we see it because we were we were like the prototype
Yeah.
for this kind of behavior. So yeah, really, really appreciate that perspective. And I have something. It's weird because I'm not very Irish. It's the most predominant part of my ethnic background, but I haven't like been to Ireland, I haven't studied it deeply. But there is a part of me that has a deep disdain for the English language, and I'm like English, and
It is a really
uh,
limited language. It's
yeah.
also who is it that calls it the like drain pipe of languages? That it's
Oh,
like the
that's right.
kitchen sink of languages because it's just so garbled of different.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, it's so divorced from land, I think is really what it is that it just doesn't in Irish you have so many of the words are engaged directly with the landscape, and the
yeah,
grammar is engaged directly with the landscape. And the I think when you go, one of the coolest things, whether, and if you get to go to Scotland, it's a very similar experience, or at least it was for me, is
mm,
you have all of these places that are so central to the mythology and to the folklore. And then you go, and all of a sudden, those stories are so different than
mm,
how could I even talk about land without having gone to see this 5,000-year-old yew tree in Portugal? I mean, like it just completely, it was such I think for me, it was like good slap in the face
Mm.
of like, no, 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 you can't talk about land till you're with the land. And then,
Right.
and and I think again, like to go back to our earlier conversation, herbalism is similar. Can't talk
Yeah.
about what chemical properties are in plants until you're out there with the plants.
Yeah.
And then it changes because the more you're watching and listening and paying attention, the more you're like, what an incredibly complex and like abundantly beautiful and gnarly world we live in. And that changes the way in which you decide what plants you're comfortable picking, who you pull out of your garden or, leave in your garden, who you're in relationship. I mean, relationship in a garden, I think, or something I've argued is it's a relationship of closeness, right? Like you're
Mm.
deciding what plants are not going to live because you are in close relationship with
Right.
certain plants and have commitments to certain plants. You're in a social contract with them.
Right.
And if you're someone who takes, I don't know if sentience or intelligence or consciousness seriously is none all of those words I think are so limited and all they do is describe states.
Mm.
And I will, plug. Everyone's read this book, so I don't need to say that I'm the only one plugging this. But Mary Jane Rubinstein's Pantheologies, I think,
Mm.
is the
Yeah.
helpful one of the books of like, okay, read this, then go out into the world, then go out into the garden and see how you feel. Um, but that question that I get, especially from people who are gardeners, who are like, if plants are conscious, what do I do?
Yeah.
It's a these are ethical commitments that are deeply relational and plenty of cultural spaces have offered insights in what to do. Uh,
Hmm.
and whether that's looking at gardening literature or looking at mythology or, honoring the cultural relationships between land and plants or land and people from in the indigenous communities in the area in which you live, whether you're a settler or you're, however you identify. But that's also, I think, critical is to say like, okay, well, how do the people whose land this is, how do they relate to the plants? And whether or not it's appropriate to like if there are classes or talks available, trying to approach with humility and with respect rather than with like, okay, well now I know what to do. I'm gonna go do that. Like, no, it's more complicated than that. And I think the more that you spend time with plants, the more you're like, oh, everything is so complicated. Like,
Hmm.
and I'm never gonna get it quite right, but by gosh, I'm gonna try.
That is a beautiful sentiment. And you know, we have to do this again soon.
I'd be
'Cause
happy to.
I
Thank you.
feel like I'm barely scratching the surface. I have so much more I want to talk to you about, but I do try to keep episodes around an hour or under. And I know you got some of these 3-hour podcasts out there. They do exist.
Mm.
Try to keep it around an hour. So yeah, we have to do this again because yeah, I feel like there's so many more questions that I have for you, and yeah, just some of my favorite topics in the whole world. Even the way that you're
Me
just like,
too.
sentience, consciousness, intelligence. I don't know. They're just describing states. I'm just like, we have to talk about that for a few more hours. Uh, and so this is just great. So I'll tell you what. We'll close this up for now.
Cool.
And one of the ways I like to do this is to ask the guest, in this case, this is you, and to give us one word or a phrase, could be a phrase, and that'll be the way we close out. Just a word to send us off or a phrase to send us off. I know that's kind of like a mean assignment to give because it's hard. It's like so much pressure, especially for anybody in academia, to just put a word or a phrase. Could be anything, anything whatsoever, and that'll be the way we close out the episode. So, Natalia, do you have a word or a phrase for us?
Um, yeah, I do. I do. I want to make sure I'm gonna say it in Irish, in Old
Ah, wonderful.
Irish, or I'd like to if I can find it. The English I can just tell you it's yew tree, little yew tree. But it's in the vocative and the diminutive in the Bulia Scrivener
Mm,
material. And that's what I'm arguing that we take seriously is
right.
that he's showing, he's expressing, he's speaking directly to a plant, which an assumption that the plant is listening and or it has some form of agency. And he's speaking in the diminutive, so there's care. So
Yeah.
I think it will take me too long to find the, Ivor, I don't want to mispronounce. So yeah, yew tree, little yew tree.